The Hall of Concordance on Ossivar Prime did not echo. It absorbed. Every footstep, every murmur, every breath drawn by the 1,000 delegates gathered beneath its vaulted crystalline ceiling vanished into walls grown from living lattice stone, a material the Ossivar had cultivated for 11,000 years specifically, so that no voice in this chamber could ever rise above another. It was, the Ossivar liked to say, the most perfectly equal room in the galaxy. It was also, though none of them would ever admit it, a room built by a species so old and so thoroughly telepathically bound to one another that they had long ago forgotten what it felt like to need to raise their voices at all. Light in the chamber came not from any visible source but from the lattice stone itself, a soft, pearlescent glow that shifted almost imperceptibly with the collective mood of the Ossivar gathered beneath it. Pale blue when calm, deepening toward violet when the conquered shared consciousness. The vast telepathic communion the Ossivar called simply the lattice registered something closer to alarm. Tonight the chamber burned a deep, unbroken violet, had burned that color for 6 hours, ever since the moment a conquered Hymen, one of only 9 living beings whose consciousness anchored the entire species' shared awareness, had gone silent in the lattice mid-communion, her thread simply and catastrophically severed, an event the Ossivar had a word for that existed in no other language in the galaxy, because no other species had ever needed one. Unbecoming. Delegates from across the Ossivan Concord's 83-member worlds packed the galleries in silent, coiled rows, their crystalline exoskeletons catching the violet light and scattering it in fractured, uneasy patterns across the chamber floor. The air itself, filtered through the same lattice stone that lined the walls, carried a faint, mineral sweetness the Ossivar called thren, a scent released only under conditions of collective distress, present so rarely in the chamber's 11,000-year history that most delegates present had encountered it only in historical records, never in the chamber itself, never on their own breath. Junior attachés from a dozen newly contacted species, still learning to read the subtle grammar of Ossivar collective emotion, exchanged uncertain glances in the outer galleries, uncertain whether the scent and the color and the terrible stillness of the room meant they should be afraid, and slowly, watching the older delegations around them go rigid with a fear 4,000 years deep, coming to understand that they should. And near the back, beneath a gallery rarely used by anyone above the rank of junior attaché, stood a single human, alone, hands folded, expression composed, watching an ancient empire's oldest fear settle over the room like a held breath that would not release. Her name meant nothing to most of the delegates present. It would, within the week, mean everything. High Adjudicator Vesrian Call, presiding officer of the Concord's judiciary lattice, rose from the central dais, his voice carrying through the chamber not through sound alone, but through the faint telepathic undertow every Ossivar present could feel pressing against the edges of their shared awareness. A sensation humans in the chamber could only describe later as being spoken to by weather. The lattice does not sever itself, he said. Hymen Threlaxi did not choose to unbecome. Something reached into her communion and tore the thread by force, a violation this conquered has not suffered in 4,000 years. The human delegation's technology was present in the Hymen sanctum at the hour of her severance. The human diplomat Naomi Reyes was alone with her in the final minutes of her thread. The conquered finds no other explanation consistent with the evidence before it. He turned, and the violet light of the chamber deepened, impossibly, further still. Ambassador Reyes will be remanded to Reeducation. Her mind, whatever damage she has done to it or others, will be unmade and remade in service to the conquered she has wronged. Earth will be permitted to keep its seat at this table only so long as it does not object to what happens next. Naomi Reyes did not move, did not flinch, did not look away from the adjudicator's crystalline gaze even as 2 Ossivar enforcers, their exoskeletons the deep, ceremonial black reserved for the conquered's Reeducation caste, began moving toward her through the silent, absorbing dark. Her name was Ambassador Naomi Reyes, and she had spent 9 years learning that the Osavan conquered trusted almost nothing it could not directly feel. This was, she had come to understand within her first month on Osavar Prime, the central and defining fact of dealing with a species whose entire civilization was built atop the lattice. A telepathic communion so complete that individual Osavar rarely experienced true privacy of thought, so seamless that lying to one another was, for most practical purposes, a physical impossibility rather than merely a moral one. It made the Osavar in most matters the most straightforward negotiating partners humanity had ever encountered. It also made them almost pathologically unable to imagine that a species outside the lattice, a species capable of true, opaque, unverifiable privacy of thought, might be telling the truth about something the lattice itself could not confirm. Naomi had built her entire diplomatic career on that single insight. Where her predecessors in the Terran Corps had approached the Osavar with the same open, expressive warmth that worked well enough with most newly contacted species, Naomi had done something almost nobody expected from a human. She had made herself legible. She had spent her first 2 years on Osavar Prime submitting, voluntarily and without being asked, to every partial telepathic scan the Concord's medical lattice was capable of performing on a non-lattice-bound species, not because it was required of her, but because she understood, faster than any human diplomat before her, that trust in this empire was not built through eloquent words. It was built through the slow, patient demonstration that you had nothing in your mind you were afraid to have examined. It was this reputation, 9 years painstakingly built, the most thoroughly vetted, thoroughly trusted human being the Osavan conquered had ever encountered, that made the accusation against her, when it came, so devastating precisely because it seemed, on its face, so impossible to credibly deny. If the conquered's own lattice could not immediately clear her, what human explanation could possibly outweigh it? There was a story, told often among the junior ranks of the Terran embassy on Osavar Prime, about Naomi's second year on the planet, when a delegation of conquered industrialists had attempted to pressure her into accepting a trade framework that quietly disadvantaged 3 smaller member worlds in exchange for preferential terms favoring Earth. Every human diplomat before her had approached negotiations of this kind the way humans on Earth had negotiated for centuries, angling for the best outcome available, trusting the other side to do the same. Naomi had done something that unsettled the industrialists far more than any counteroffer could have. She had voluntarily disclosed, in full, the framework's disadvantages to the 3 smaller worlds before either side had signed anything, and had then asked the industrialists plainly whether they intended the terms to remain so lopsided once the affected worlds could see them clearly. The negotiation that followed took considerably longer than the industrialists had planned, and produced a framework none of them would have chosen on their own, and every conquered member present would later describe as the most durable trade arrangement Osavar Prime had signed with an outside species in a generation, precisely because no one involved had needed to wonder, afterward, what had been hidden from them. It was not, Naomi always insisted when the story was repeated back to her over the years, an act of exceptional virtue. It was, she said, simply the only strategy that could ever work with a species incapable of imagining sustained deception among its own kind. Any human diplomat clever enough to negotiate around that blind spot would only ever build an advantage that lasted exactly as long as it went undiscovered. And with a species bound by an unbreakable telepathic communion, undiscovered was never going to last nearly as long as any Terran negotiator might hope. It was this same instinct, legibility over cleverness, patience over advantage, that had made her, by her 4th year on the Council, one of the very few outside diplomats the Concord's own judiciary caste occasionally consulted informally on matters entirely unrelated to Earth's own interests, A degree of trust extended to almost no other non-Osevar voice in conquered history. It was precisely that trust, so carefully built over 9 years, that the accusation against her now threatened to unmake in a single violet evening. She had been in Hyman Threlaxy's sanctum that evening for an entirely unremarkable reason: a scheduled consultation on the deployment of a small Terran diagnostic array, a modest piece of Earth technology the Hyman had personally requested to study, intrigued by human medical instruments that operated entirely outside any telepathic framework. Naomi had walked her through its calibration for perhaps 20 minutes. Then, mid-sentence, the Hyman's crystalline form had simply gone rigid, her thread torn from the lattice with a violence every Osevar in the sanctum-adjacent corridors felt as a physical blow, and Naomi Reyes had been left alone in a room with a dying, then dead, being whose species had no framework whatsoever for believing that violence of this kind could LD occur without a hand, a mind, a will directly responsible standing right there in the room. There had been, in the sanctum, no human present besides Naomi. There had been, by the time conquered investigators arrived, no clear evidence of any other presence at all, no forced entry, no unauthorized lattice intrusion detected by the sanctum's own monitoring wards, nothing except a human diplomat, a piece of Terran diagnostic technology, and a Hyman's severed thread. It was, Naomi understood within the first hour of her confinement, exactly the kind of case that convenience loved best. A story requiring no further investigation, offered to a frightened, grieving conquered at the precise moment it most wanted an answer rather than a search. Naomi found Jonah's nervousness, in that first supervised visit, oddly steadying rather than distressing, a reminder that whatever came next, she was not facing it entirely alone. She had met him only twice before her confinement, in passing, at embassy functions where he had said little and listened carefully. The same instinct she recognized, with a small, private flicker of recognition, from her own earliest years on Osevar Prime. He had transferred to the Terran Corps from a modest posting on a Terran research outpost, drawn to diplomatic work. He had once told a colleague, because he found he was better at listening for what people meant than at guessing what they wanted to hear. An instinct the Corps recruiters had flagged early and pushed, gently but insistently, toward Osevar Prime specifically, a posting few junior diplomats requested and fewer still thrived in. "I don't know how to do what you're asking," he admitted to her, in that first visit, his voice low enough that the enforcer stationed at the chamber's threshold would not easily overhear. "I've been here 18 months. I don't have your standing. I don't know adjudicator Thress beyond her name." "You don't need standing to ask a question," Naomi said. "You need only to ask it of the right person plainly, and then to actually listen to the answer instead of the one you expect. I've built 9 years of relationships in this Concord that I cannot use from inside a confinement chamber. You can. That is the entire job, for the next several days, not solving this alone, but carrying what I cannot carry myself to people who can." It was a small thing, that first conversation, and Jonah would later describe it, in interviews given long after the case had passed into Terran Diplomatic Academy curriculum, as the moment he stopped thinking of himself as a bystander to a crisis too large for him and started, instead, doing the only kind of work available to him: showing up, asking plainly, and listening carefully to what came back. It was, in its own modest way, exactly the same lesson Naomi had spent 9 years teaching an entire empire, offered now, in the space of a single sentence, to a frightened young envoy with 18 months of experience and nothing but the willingness to try. In the quiet hours between Jonah's visits, alone in the confinement chamber with nothing to occupy her but the slow turning count of a week she did not know if she would survive, Naomi found herself returning, again and again, to the same discipline that had carried her through 9 years of careful diplomatic work: the refusal to let fear decide what she did next. She did not know in those hours whether Senevic Thress's suspicions would ever produce proof. She did not know whether Earth's own diplomatic corps, hearing of her sentencing, would react with the same restraint Fleet Admiral Nkosi had once shown at Vantral, or whether this crisis, so much stranger and more opaque than the last, would provoke something far less patient. She chose, in each of those uncertain hours, to spend her remaining time as usefully as she could rather than as fearfully as she might have, reviewing from memory every detail of her final conversation with Hyman Threlaxi, searching for anything she might have missed, anything that might help Senovic's investigation move faster than it otherwise would. Reeducation in Osevar practice was not execution. The Conquered considered itself, and in most respects genuinely was, one of the more measured and humane civilizations in known space. Its judiciary lattice built, like most Osevar institutions, atop the same collective telepathic communion that made honest dealing between individual Osevar so effortless. But reeducation was, in its own way, a kind of death. The process, administered through the same lattice technology that bound the Conquered's 9 hymens into a single continuous awareness, did not simply punish a mind. It unmade it, layer by careful layer, and rebuilt it according to templates the Conquered's judiciary caste considered properly aligned with Conquered values, a process the Osevar genuinely believed to be rehabilitative rather than cruel, precisely because they had never, in 4,000 years, needed to apply it to a species whose mind operated on principles the lattice could not actually read. No one in the chamber, not even Vesrian Call, seemed to have fully considered what reeducation might do to a human mind, built on neural architecture the lattice had never mapped, subjected to a rebuilding process calibrated entirely for Osevar cognition. Naomi Reyes understood, in the cold, clear hour after her sentencing, that she might well be the first human being in history for whom reeducation and death meant precisely the same thing, delivered through a mechanism gentle enough that the Conquered would never even recognize what it had done. The Conquered's medical judiciary caste, when Chief Arbiter Kresh quietly pressed them in the hours after sentencing for an honest assessment of what reeducation would actually do to a non-lattice mind, could offer no reassurance at all, only a careful, evasive acknowledgement that the process had never once, in 4,000 years, been tested on a species whose consciousness existed entirely outside Osevar communion architecture, and that the honest answer to what it would do to Naomi Reyes was that nobody in the Conquered actually knew. It might unmake her gently, as it had unmade thousands of condemned Osevar before her, leaving behind a mind reshaped but intact. It might, just as plausibly, find nothing coherent to rebuild at all, the lattice's rebuilding templates reaching for neural patterns that simply were not there, leaving whatever remained a kind of hollow, wandering echo of a person that had once been Naomi Reyes. No one could say. No one, in the 6 hours after her sentencing, seemed particularly inclined to find out before proceeding regardless. She had 1 week. The Conquered's own procedural law, one of the few genuinely fixed constraints on judiciary action, a holdover from an older, more cautious era of Osevar jurisprudence, required a 7-day period between sentencing and the administration of reeducation, a window originally intended to allow a condemned Osevar's own lattice thread to be gently prepared for the process. To minimize trauma to the wider Conquered communion, the mind remained connected to even in judgment. For Naomi, unconnected to the lattice at all, the week served no such gentle purpose. It served only one. It was time. She did not spend it in despair. She spent it from the very first hour of her confinement, doing precisely what 9 years on Osevar Prime had trained her to do better than almost anyone alive. She began, patiently, methodically, to make herself legible again, this time not to prove her innocence to a Conquered that had already decided against her, but to find the one piece of evidence a species built on unbreakable collective telepathy had never once needed to imagine might be hidden from itself. The junior Terran attaché who found her, permitted a single supervised visit in the first hours of her confinement, was a nervous young analyst named Jonah Weiss, barely 18 months into his posting, his voice unsteady as he asked her, without preamble, what he could possibly do. "Find second adjudicator Senovic Thress," Naomi said, calm, even exactly as she had been in the Hall of Concordance 6 hours earlier. Quietly, not through official channels. She sat beside High Adjudicator Call during my sentencing and said nothing throughout the entire proceeding. In 9 years, I have never once seen Senovic Thress hold silence during a judgment she believed was just. Something is wrong with this verdict, and I think she already suspects what it is. Jonah found her within the hour, in a modest chamber overlooking the lower agricultural terraces of Ossivar Prime, her crystalline form catching the pale light of the planet's twin moons in slow, uneasy pulses of blue-gray. A color, Jonah would later learn, that meant something close to guilt held in reserve, awaiting permission to be spoken. "I did not stop the sentencing," Senovic told him without being asked, the moment he identified himself as Naomi's envoy, "because I could not yet prove what I suspected, and an accusation without proof in this chamber in this hour would only have looked like the very same convenience the conquered was already reaching for, a second story offered too quickly, to relieve a fear too large for anyone to sit with patiently." She paused, her light dimming further. Hymen Threlaxi did not simply lose her thread by accident, and I do not believe a human diplomat with no capacity to touch the lattice at all could have torn it from her. I believe something else severed it. I have believed this since the first hour. I did not yet have the courage or the proof to say so in that chamber. "Then help us find the proof," Jonah said. "We have a week." "You have less than that," Senovic said quietly, "because whatever severed Hymen Threlaxi's thread did so from within the lattice itself, and the only beings capable of reaching a Hymen's private communion from within the lattice are other Hymens. Which means, Envoy Weiss, that if I am right, the truth we are chasing is not merely inconvenient to your ambassador's accusers. It is catastrophic to the very foundation this conquered believes makes lying among ourselves impossible." What followed was 7 days of work that bore almost no resemblance to the kind of dramatic confrontation later dramatizations of the case would suggest, and every resemblance to the kind of exhausting, unglamorous forensic patience Naomi Reyes had built her entire reputation upon. Senovic Thress, exercising judiciary authority that grew more precarious with each passing hour, as whispers of her quiet involvement began reaching High Adjudicator Call's own attention, gained access to the sanctum's deep lattice logs, records of communion activity so foundational to Ossivar privacy law that no outside species, in the Concord's 4,000-year history, had ever been permitted to review them. She reviewed them anyway, this time with Naomi seated beside her. An image so unprecedented. A human diplomat granted access to the innermost architecture of the Ossivar's collective mind, that Senovic would later describe it to colleagues as the single most disorienting professional decision of her long career. And also, she would add, the one she remained most certain had been correct. On the second day, with Call's own allies within the judiciary caste beginning to press Chief Arbiter Kresh for an expedited confirmation of the sentence rather than any further review, Jonah Weiss was nearly barred from the confinement chamber entirely. A junior enforcer citing new restrictions on outside contact with a condemned prisoner that had not existed 24 hours earlier. It was Senovic herself, invoking judiciary privilege still technically hers to claim, who overruled the restriction, a decision that cost her, in the days that followed, the quiet support of 2 colleagues who had until then considered her among the judiciary caste's most promising rising officials, and who now began, carefully and without any accusation either could prove, to distance themselves from her. "I am aware of what this may cost me," she told Naomi plainly, on the third day, as the two of them worked through the deep logs in a borrowed engineering chamber never designed for forensic review, its walls lined with communion relay hardware far too delicate for the makeshift diagnostic tools Terran engineers had cobbled together to interface with it. I have decided it is an acceptable cost. I would like you to understand that this is not, for me, primarily about you, Ambassador Reyes, however much I have come to respect you these past 3 days. It is about what this Concord becomes if it allows the fastest answer to matter more than the true one, even once. I do not think I could go on serving a Concord that had made that choice and called it justice. It took 3 days to isolate the anomaly, a brief, fractional presence in the lattice's deep communion layer, present in the sanctum for less than 4 seconds in the minutes before Threlaxy's severance, a presence that bore the unmistakable signature pattern of a hymen's consciousness, and yet appeared nowhere in the Concord's official record of which hymens had been active in communion that evening. A ninth thread pretending to be absent, Senovic said, studying the anomaly with light patterns Naomi had learned, over 3 days of close work, to read as something between horror and grim vindication. There are only 9 hymens in the entire Concord. 8 are accounted for elsewhere in the lattice at the hour of Threlaxy's death. The ninth, she stopped. Say it, Naomi said quietly. The ninth was Threlaxy herself, Senovic said. Which means either the anomaly is a flaw in 4,000 years of lattice architecture no one has ever detected before. In the exact week a human stands accused of a crime only a hymen could commit, or someone has found a way to move through the deep communion layer without registering as themselves at all. A capability the Conquered does not believe exists. A capability that would mean the lattice itself, the foundation of everything we believe makes deception among Ossivar impossible, is not as unbreakable as 4,000 years of unquestioned faith has assumed. It took 2 more days, working nearly without rest, cross-referencing the fractional signature against calibration records from the Concord's own lattice engineering cast, to trace its origin, not to a flaw in the architecture at all, but to a modification, deliberate and extraordinarily sophisticated, installed in the lattice's deep communion relays 11 months earlier under an authorization that buried 3 approval layers deep in records, never meant to be cross-examined by anyone outside the judiciary cast's most senior ranks, belonged to High Ad. Judicator Vesrian Kal himself. He built a way to move through the lattice unseen, Senovic said, her light burning a color Naomi had not yet seen in 3 days of study, one she did not need translated to understand. And Hymen Threlaxy discovered it. Naomi brought the findings to Senovic's superior, Chief Arbiter Ilvina Kresh, the only judiciary official senior enough to formally challenge a high adjudicator's own conduct. On the morning of the 6th day, with roughly 30 hours remaining before Naomi's scheduled reeducation. Kresh received them not in any formal judiciary chamber, but in her own modest quarters, a choice Senovic would later explain was deliberate, Kresh's long instinct, cultivated over 4 centuries of service, that the most consequential judgments were rarely improved by the weight of ceremony pressing down on the room where they were made. She listened to the full case without interruption, her ancient, finely fractured crystalline form catching the early light in slow, careful pulses that gave away nothing of what she was thinking. A discipline Naomi recognized, with something like professional admiration, as its own kind of 9 years in the making legibility, earned the opposite way Naomi had earned her own, not through openness, but through 4 centuries of learning exactly how much of herself to reveal and when. Chief Arbiter Kresh, an ancient Ossivar whose crystalline form had grown pale and finely fractured with age, studied the evidence in a silence that stretched long enough for Jonah Weiss to begin visibly counting the minutes. "You are asking this Concord," she said finally, "to believe that its own presiding judiciary officer murdered a hymen, then engineered the swiftest possible condemnation of an innocent alien diplomat to bury the crime before anyone thought to look elsewhere. Do you understand what you are asking this Concord to accept about itself?" "I understand it," Naomi said. I'm not asking you to take my word or even adjudicator Thress's word. I am asking you to examine the deep lattice logs yourselves, through your own most trusted engineers, independent of anyone in Vesrian Call's judiciary chain. If I am wrong, nothing changes, my re-education proceeds as scheduled, and you will have lost only a day confirming it. If I am right, you have roughly 30 hours to stop this conquered from unmaking an innocent mind to protect a guilty one. Kresh studied her for a long moment with eyes that had seen 4 centuries of Osivar jurisprudence, then rose from her seat and walked, slowly, to the window, overlooking the terraces below, her back to the room for what felt to Jonah like an unbearably long minute. I have served this judiciary caste for 400 years, she said finally, without turning. I have signed my name to sentences I believed at the time to be just, and have lived long enough to learn, on 3 separate occasions across those centuries, that at least one of them was not. That is the quiet burden of any long career spent judging others. The certainty that patience, however carefully practiced, will occasionally still fail you. I do not know, standing here, whether this is a fourth such occasion, or whether Ambassador Reyes and Adjudicator Thress have simply built an elaborate and understandable hope out of thin evidence, desperate to find any alternative to what feels to both of them like an unbearable outcome. I intend to find out properly rather than guess. Bring me your engineers, Adjudicator Thress. I will bring mine. Let us see together whether the truth agrees with either of you. She turned then to Senevic. Why did Vesrian Call do this? What did the Hymen discover that was worth 4,000 years of conquered trust to hide? It was Senevic, working through the final hours before Naomi's sentence, who found the answer buried deepest of all. An 11-month pattern of subtle lattice manipulation, traceable now that the anomalous signature had been identified, in which Vesrian Call had been quietly, incrementally influencing judiciary communion on a string of unrelated rulings, trade disputes, resource allocations, minor border adjustments among conquered member worlds. Each adjustment small enough to escape notice individually, each one benefiting, with a consistency too precise to be coincidence. A block of core conquered industrial worlds whose economic interests Call had represented for decades before rising to the judiciary. Hymen Threlaxi, whose communion duties gave her a vantage across the lattice broader than any single judiciary officer's, had begun to notice the pattern roughly 3 weeks before her death. She had said nothing publicly. She had Senevic's final review of the deep logs confirmed, requested a private consultation with Call himself 4 days before her death. A consultation, the records now made clear, in which she had almost certainly confronted him directly. He did not plan to kill her, Kresh said quietly, reviewing the final assembled case in the hour before dawn on the 7th day. I do not believe, reading this, that murder was ever his intention when this began. I believe he built a tool to quietly correct outcomes he had convinced himself were owed to worlds the conquered had neglected, told himself for 11 months that the harm was small enough not to matter, and then, confronted at last by the one being positioned to see the whole pattern, discovered he had already built every tool he needed to make the consequence disappear, and reached for the nearest convenient story to bury it instead of the truth he could no longer face. She brought the completed case before the full grand concordance with 11 hours remaining before Naomi's scheduled re-education, invoking an emergency judiciary review that had not been exercised against a sitting high adjudicator in over 600 years. The chamber, when Senevic entered flanked by Chief Arbiter Kresh and, unprecedentedly, Naomi Reyes herself, released under emergency provision for the sole purpose of presenting evidence in her own defense, fell into a silence heavier than any Naomi had felt in 9 years on Osivar Prime. A senior delegate from one of the industrial world's Call had spent 11 months quietly favoring Rose almost immediately. His crystalline form flushed a sharp, defensive amber. This is a proceeding built on the word of a junior adjudicator and an alien defendant against the Concord's own presiding judiciary officer, he said. I would remind this chamber what such an accusation, unproven, could do to the stability of the judiciary caste itself, at a moment when this Concord can least afford further doubt in its own foundations. I share your concern for this Concord's stability, Kresh said, her ancient, fractured light steady and unhurried. It is precisely why I intend to resolve this doubt with evidence rather than allow it to fester unresolved. You are welcome to examine every record we present yourself, through engineers of your own choosing, independent of my office entirely. I would ask only that you extend the review the same patience you would wish extended to you, were the accusation someday your own. The delegate did not rise again. Vesrian Kaul did not deny it well. Osevar deception, even at the highest levels of the judiciary caste, was a fragile, exhausting art, sustainable only through the very lattice evasion tool he had built to hide it. And the moment Chief Arbiter Kresh formally presented the deep-log evidence to the assembled concordance, projected across the chamber's absorbing walls for every delegate to examine independently, his composure did not merely crack. It dissolved entirely, his crystalline form flushing a raw, uncontrolled crimson that every Osevar present recognized, with a kind of collective horror, as grief and guilt with nowhere left to hide. I never intended her harm, he said, his voice carrying through the lattice with none of its earlier commanding weight. I intended only to correct what this Concord had let go uncorrected for a generation. She would not listen. She would have unmade 11 months of careful, necessary work in a single confession to this chamber, and I could not. He stopped. It was already too late, and every delegate in the chamber, feeling the raw and undisguised truth of it through the lattice itself, understood that no further words would change what they now knew. An elder delegate from one of the smaller member worlds Kaul's manipulations had quietly disadvantaged rose slowly in the long silence that followed, her voice carrying none of the anger Naomi might have expected, only a weary, ancient sorrow. 4,000 years, she said, we have told ourselves that the lattice makes this impossible among our own kind. I wonder now how many of the outcomes I have accepted without question in my own years on this council were never quite as inevitable as I believed them to be. I do not ask this to excuse what has been done to Ambassador Reyes. I ask it because I think this Concord owes itself the same rigorous doubt it so nearly failed to extend to her. He was remanded to the Concord's own judiciary custody within the hour, a bitter, exacting irony that the Grand Concordance did not fail to note aloud, delegate after delegate rising in the absorbing violet dark, to observe that the very sentence Vesrian Kaul had engineered for an innocent human diplomat, the Concord's judiciary caste now moved, with grim and deliberate formality, to consider for him. Naomi Reyes' sentence was vacated with less than 6 hours remaining before it would have been carried out. Chief Arbiter Kresh delivered the reversal personally, standing before Naomi in the same modest confinement chamber where she had spent 7 days doing the patient, unglamorous work that had saved her own life. This Concord owes you an accounting, Kresh said. That will take considera. Bly longer than 7 days to properly deliver. I do not believe 7 days was ever enough to earn back what was so quickly taken from you in a single evening. I intend to spend a great deal longer than that trying. Naomi received the news with the same quiet composure that had carried her through the entire ordeal, though Jonah Weiss, present in the chamber for the reversal, would later say it was the first and only moment across the whole 7 days that he saw her hands, folded as always, tremble even slightly before she steadied them. She thanked Kresh formally, in the careful Osevar diplomatic phrasing she had spent 9 years mastering, and then asked, before anything else, whether Senovic Thress and Jonah himself would face any judiciary consequence for the risks each had taken on her behalf. It was, Kresh told her, an entirely unnecessary question to ask in the moment of her own exoneration, and also, Kresh added, precisely the question Kresh would have expected from her, having reviewed 9 years of Naomi's diplomatic record in the sleepless hours before reaching her decision. The weeks that followed Vesrian Kal's confession were, for the Asavan conquered, a reckoning unlike anything in its 4,000-year written history. A civilization that had built its entire understanding of trust atop the assumption that the lattice made true deception between Asavar impossible now had to confront. In the full glare of Grand Concordance session after Grand Concordance session, the fact that one of its most senior officials had spent nearly a year proving that assumption false, and that the Concord's own reflexive faith in its unbreakable communion had made it faster to condemn an outsider than to imagine the failure might lie within. Chief Arbiter Kresh, thrust into a position of far greater prominence than her long, quiet career had ever sought, spent the better part of a year leading the Concord's most sweeping judiciary reform in 6 centuries, new independent verification protocols for any lattice-based evidence used in a capital judgment, an entirely reconstructed engineering oversight body empowered to audit the deep communion relays no one had ever thought to audit before, and at Naomi's own quiet insistence. A formal 7-day minimum review period for any non-Asavar defendant, during which independent forensic teams, human included, would be guaranteed full access to evidence before any irreversible sentence could be carried out. Senevik Thress, who had risked her own standing on the strength of a suspicion she could not yet prove, was elevated to chief adjudicator within the year, the youngest Asavar ever to hold the position, still visibly uncomfortable, in every account Jonah Weiss gave of her in those months, with the weight the honor carried. Vesrian Kal's trial stretched nearly 4 months, the Concord's judiciary cast determined, as Chief Arbiter Kresh put it in her opening remarks, to give this proceeding every patience we so catastrophically failed to give the Ambassador Kal condemned. He was ultimately convicted of conspiracy, unauthorized lattice modification, and the murder of a sitting Highmind, a verdict that carried, under the Concord's oldest and most severe judiciary tradition, precisely the sentence he had once so swiftly ordered for Naomi Reyes. Reeducation, administered this time under every safeguard his own crime had exposed as absent, a slow, careful, thoroughly documented unmaking of the mind that had built a tool to hide the truth from an entire civilization, built on the promise that hiding was impossible. The trial's 4 months of testimony painted a portrait of Kal considerably more complicated than the simple villain the Concord's early, furious response to his confession had assumed. He had risen through the judiciary caste from one of the Concord's oldest, and by his own account, most persistently overlooked industrial worlds, a sector whose contributions to the Concord's early expansion had, in his telling, gone systematically undercompensated for nearly 2 centuries, an imbalance he had watched grow more entrenched with each passing decade of judiciary rulings that favored the newer, more politically fashionable member worlds. He had not set out, by his own testimony and by the corroborating account of colleagues who had known him for decades, to build a tool for personal enrichment. He had built it in the earliest months, telling himself it was a corrective, a quiet counterweight to a Concord he had come to believe was systematically, if unintentionally, failing the worlds that had built its foundation. He was not wrong that the Concord had grown complacent about its oldest debts, Chief Arbiter Kresh told Naomi privately, in the quiet weeks after the trial concluded, over a modest meal in her chambers, the first time either of them had spoken without an active proceeding weighing between them. He was catastrophically wrong about what he was entitled to do about it alone, in secret, without ever bringing his grievance before this chamber honestly. 4,000 years of believing lying among ourselves was impossible made it very easy for this Concord to never build the habit of examining its own comfortable assumptions. Vesrian Kal did not create that vulnerability. He simply became the first being patient and clever enough to find it. It did not excuse what he had done, and Naomi was careful, in every account of the case she gave in the years that followed, never to suggest otherwise. But it complicated the story in a way she found herself unable to set aside entirely, and she thought of it often in later years, whenever a young cadet in her academy addresses spoke too easily about villains and heroes. The difference between a Concord that nearly re-educated an innocent woman and a Concord that ultimately did not, she came to believe, had never been about who among them was good and who was evil. It had been almost entirely about who, in the end, was willing to slow down long enough to check. Naomi did not attend the sentencing. She had been asked, and had declined gently, without any bitterness Jonah Weiss could detect in her answer. "I don't need to see it happen to know it's just," she told him. "I spent 7 days hoping this Concord would choose patience over convenience for my sake. I'd rather spend the day after his sentencing making sure they keep choosing it than watching the moment they finally did." 1 year passed, then several more. The Hall of Concordance had not changed its architecture. The Osavar were not a species given to grand physical gestures of transformation, preferring instead the slower, more thorough work of transforming what the architecture was actually used for. But the light in the chamber, delegates from newer member worlds often remarked, seemed to settle now into a steadier, more contemplative blue far more often than it once had, the deep violets of alarm and suspicion reserved, in the years since Kahl's conviction, for genuine crises rather than convenient ones. The independent verification protocols Chief Arbiter Kresh had fought to establish were tested, seriously, only twice in the years that followed. Once in a dispute involving a newly contacted crystalline species, whose own communication method the lattice initially misread as evasive, and once, more painfully, in a case involving an Osavar judiciary officer whose conduct came under suspicion in a matter entirely unrelated to Kahl's crime. In both cases, the protocols held. In both cases, the patient, unglamorous work of independent review reached a conclusion the Concord's older instincts might once have reached in a single convenient afternoon, and reached it, this time, correctly. The first of those cases, in particular, became something of a quiet touchstone within the reformed judiciary caste in the years that followed. The crystalline species in question, a recently contacted people called the Vethrin, communicated not through the lattice at all but through a slow, deliberate refraction of light across their bodies, a method that Osavar sensory instruments, calibrated over millennia entirely around telepathic communion, had initially misread as a kind of evasive flickering, consistent, the Concord's oldest instincts insisted, with deliberate deception. A junior adjudicator, trained under the very reformed Senovic Thress had championed, insisted on a full 7-day independent review before any judgment was rendered against the Vethrin delegation under suspicion. The review revealed, in the end, nothing more sinister than an unfamiliar species communicating in an unfamiliar way, and the adjudicator who had insisted on the delay, a young Osavar named Kelavar Thess, who had entered the Judiciary Academy the same year Naomi Reyes' sentence was vacated, would later credit that single case with convincing him he had chosen the right vocation after all, in a Concord that might once have condemned an innocent species for the crime of simply looking, to old and frightened eyes, like it might be lying. Senovic Thress, who had risked her own standing on the strength of a suspicion she could not yet prove, was elevated to chief adjudicator within the year, the youngest Osavar ever to hold the position, still visibly uncomfortable, in every account Jonah Weiss gave of her in those months, with the weight the honor carried. She used the position, in the years that followed, to expand the 7-day review standard well beyond its original application to non-Osavar defendants, arguing before the Grand Concordance on 3 separate occasions that any judgment carrying an irreversible consequence, reeducation chief among them, but eventually extended to a handful of other conquered punishments, the reformed judiciary caste came slowly to view with newly critical eyes. deserved the same patience the conquered had so nearly failed to extend to Naomi Ray. Yes, Chief Arbiter Kresh did not live to see the full maturation of the reforms she had begun. She passed, in the manner Ossivar of great age typically did, gently and by her own choosing, surrounded by the lattice communion of colleagues she had served for 4 centuries, roughly 6 years after Call's conviction. Her final formal act as chief arbiter was to preside over the induction of the Reformed Judiciary Academy's first graduating class. Human and Ossivar cadets standing together in the same modest chamber overlooking the agricultural terraces. An image that, Jonah Weiss would later say, would have seemed almost unimaginable to anyone who had witnessed the violet, fearful silence of the Hall of Concordance on the night Naomi Reyes was first sentenced. Naomi Reyes remained on Ossivar Prime through all of it, though her role within the Terran delegation shifted, over the years, from ambassador to something closer to institutional conscience. Quietly consulted by Senevic Thress on nearly every major judiciary reform the conquered undertook, sought out, increasingly, not only by human colleagues, but by young Ossivar jurists themselves, curious how a species with no access to the lattice at all had managed to build, over 9 careful years, the kind of legibility and trust that even the conquered's own most senior officials had once failed to earn from one another. She gave, each year, a single address to the incoming cohort of the Concord's Judiciary Academy. Human and Ossivar cadets seated together in a modest chamber, overlooking the same agricultural terraces where Senevic Thress had first agreed to risk her own standing on an unproven suspicion. She told the story plainly, without embellishment, the same story every year, though those who attended more than once often noted that she never told it quite the same way twice, some new detail or reflection surfacing each time as though she were still, even years later, turning the 7 days over in her mind, still finding something new to understand about what they had cost and what they had ultimately proven. "I want to be honest with you about something most retellings of this story leave out," she told one such gathering, 7 years almost to the day after her sentencing, a young Ossivar cadet in the front row still catching the pale morning light in slow, attentive pulses of blue. "The Conquered did not save me because it discovered, in 7 days, that it had been wrong about humanity. It saved me because a handful of individuals, Senevic Thress, Chief Arbiter Kresh, a nervous young envoy named Jonah Weiss who had been in his posting less than 2 years, chose, separately and at real personal risk, to be patient in a moment when the entire weight of an ancient, frightened civilization was pulling everyone around them toward the fastest, most convenient answer instead. That is the actual lesson, if there is one. Not that truth always wins. Only that it can, when enough people are willing to spend the time it costs to find it, even when, especially when, finding it means admitting the fault lies closer to home than anyone wanted to believe." A cadet near the middle of the gathering, an Ossivar whose light pattern flickered with the particular uncertainty of someone about to ask a question they had turned over for some time, raised a hand. "Ambassador Reyes, if I may, what became of the tool High Adjudicator Call built, the means of moving through the deep communion layer unseen? I have heard conflicting accounts of whether it was fully destroyed, or whether some understanding of how he built it remains, in careful hands, should this Conquered ever need it again." Naomi considered the question carefully, aware, as she always was in these addresses, that some answers carried weight well beyond the immediate curiosity that prompted them. Chief Arbiter Kresh made the decision, before her passing, that the underlying principle should not be destroyed but studied, carefully, under the strictest oversight this Conquered has ever applied to any single piece of knowledge, by engineers accountable to a body independent of the judiciary caste entirely. Her reasoning, which I happen to share, was that pretending a vulnerability does not exist has never once made a civilization safer from those who might rediscover it independently. Better, she believed, that the Conquered understand its own foundations fully, including the uncomfortable parts, then continue resting its trust in an unbreakable communion it had never actually tested against a mind patient and clever enough to try. I do not know whether that was the correct choice. I know it was the harder one, and in my experience, harder choices made with full honesty tend to age better than easier ones made in comfortable ignorance. A young human cadet near the back raised a hand. Ambassador Reyes, do you ever resent them, the conquered I mean, for how close they came to getting it wrong? Naomi considered the question with the same unhurried care she gave every question in these annual sessions. I spent a great deal of my first year here learning to be legible to a species that could not otherwise imagine trusting me, she said. I understand, better than most, how much easier it is to fear what you cannot immediately verify than to do the slow work of checking. I don't think the Concord's mistake, in the end, was so different from mistakes every civilization I have studied has made at least once, including my own. What matters to me is not whether they came close to getting it wrong. It's that when the truth finally reached them, they were willing to let it change their minds, and willing, harder still, to change the institutions that had made the mistake so easy to make in the first place. That is a rarer thing than most species manage. I choose to measure the conquered by what it did after, not only by what very nearly happened before. She let the answer settle over the gathered cadets, the pale morning light shifting slowly across a room that held, in a way it never quite had in her own first years on Ossivar Prime, human and Ossivar cadets seated together without any visible distinction in how carefully either was listened to. 7 days once decided whether I would keep my own mind, she said. I have spent every year since trying to make sure the next 7 days, whenever they come, whoever they come for, are met with a little more patience than mine were. That is the only inheritance I know how to leave you. Not a guarantee that this Concord, or any other, will always choose correctly. Only the certainty that choosing correctly has never once been about how fast an answer could be reached. Only about whether anyone in the room was still willing, when the fastest answer felt safest, to ask whether it was also true. The chamber held its quiet a moment longer, the terraces beyond the windows catching the same pale gold light that, some mornings, still reminded Jonah Weiss, now a senior envoy in his own right, seated near the back of every one of these annual addresses he could manage to attend, of the exact shade the lattice itself had settled into in the hour Naomi Reyes' sentence was finally, formally undone. He had told the story himself once at a smaller gathering of new Terran arrivals to Ossivar Prime who had asked him, over a quiet meal, what it had actually felt like, those 7 days, to be an 18-month envoy suddenly carrying a condemned ambassador's fate between meetings he had no standing to request and colleagues who had every reason to turn him away. He had struggled in that telling to find words adequate to the particular fear of those days, not the dramatic fear of open danger, but the slower, more corrosive fear of not knowing whether patience would be rewarded before time simply ran out regardless of how hard anyone worked. What he remembered most, he told them, was not the relief of the case's final hours, but the ordinary, unglamorous texture of the days before it, Senovic Thress reviewing logs until her light dimmed with exhaustion, Naomi Reyes reconstructing a conversation from memory with the same careful patience she brought to everything, himself simply showing up, again and again, to ask the next question and carry back whatever answer came. It had not felt in the moment like the kind of story anyone would later tell in a chamber full of cadets. It had felt like work. He had come to believe in the years since that this was very nearly always what the difference between catastrophe and justice actually looked like from the inside. Not a single dramatic turn, but an accumulation of ordinary people doing ordinary, exhausting, unglamorous work, for as many hours as it took, because the alternative was unthinkable to them. And it was Naomi, closing the address as she always did, who offered the words that the Concord's own Judiciary Academy would, in time, inscribe above the entrance to its newly reformed evidentiary chambers, in both Ossivar communion script and human lettering, side by side. Justice delivered quickly is not justice. It is only fear, dressed carefully enough to be mistaken for certainty, and the only cure for it is the patience to ask, every single time, whether the truth was ever actually given the chance to catch up.